Warning: this episode contains descriptions of child murder. Welcome to Australian Crime Stories. Make sure to follow on your listening platform and social media to stay up to date with the latest episodes. In 1892, Sydney was a city balancing progress and poverty. Thanks to social stigma and economic hardship, unwanted pregnancies were growing, and as a result, baby farming began to quietly thrive in the backstreets and rented terraces. When workmen uncovered the tiny remains of infants buried beneath a particular house in Macdonaldtown, the discovery unravelled a web of deceit that stretched across the city, exposing a hidden trade built on desperation and betrayal. Uncover the dark corners of this unique country with this chapter, The Baby Farming Murders. This is Australian Crime Stories. Sydney in the late 1880s was a city straining under its own growth. The harbour glittered with new shipping lanes and warehouses, but behind the terraces of the inner city lay a different world. The industrial expansion had drawn thousands of labourers, washerwomen and servants into the city's narrow streets where cottages leaned against each other and smoke hung low from factory stacks. In these working-class districts, life was crowded, precarious, and ruled by appearance. Respectability was a fragile currency, kept through clean doorsteps, quiet manners, and the ability to conceal one's misfortunes. For women, the weight of respectability was heavier still. An unmarried mother faced disgrace, dismissal from work, and social isolation. Few employers tolerated a so-called fallen woman, and few boarding houses would shelter one. Workhouses and lying-in hospitals were crowded and cold, and family support often collapsed under the shame. In such a world, even the smallest advertisement offering a good home for a baby could seem like rescue. This quiet commerce in children became known as baby farming. It began as a service that mimicked kindness, women who took in infants for a small fee to nurse or raise them as their own. Some were genuine carers, struggling mothers earning extra money by feeding another's child along with their own. But the system had no regulation, no inspection, and no records. A desperate mother might pay a lump sum of a few pounds to a stranger and leave her baby behind, believing the child would be raised in safety. In reality, many never saw them again. Two common arrangements existed. Some carers accepted weekly payments, keeping the baby until the mother could resume care. Others offered adoption for a lump sum, often claiming the child would be brought up as their own. The latter was cheaper and quieter. There were no visits, no correspondence, and no return expected. In a city where infant deaths were frequent, it was easy for an uncaring or unscrupulous carer to let a baby die without question. Deaths from diarrhea, starvation, and convulsions were so common that an extra name on a death certificate raised little concern. By the early 1890s, police and charities had begun to suspect that baby farming masked neglect and worse. Yet the system continued to operate openly because it served a social need that no institution would address. Sydney's underclass relied on silence to survive. In these back lanes and tenement rows where shame could ruin a woman faster than hunger, the promise of a good home was powerful enough to blind many to its risks. By 1892, Sydney's sanitation system was struggling to keep up with its people. In the working-class districts south of the city, cesspits overflowed, open drains ran through laneways, and the stench of night soil carts lingered long after dawn. To combat the crisis, the city had begun laying new underground sewers, linking each home to a main line that would finally carry waste away from the crowded terraces. At number 25 Burren Street, Macdonaldtown, lived Patrick Mulvey, a plumber's assistant with his wife and children. They had only just returned to their cottage in August after renting it out for 6 weeks. Patrick had decided to have a service pipe installed to link his house to the main drain. Two local labourers, James Mahoney and Frank Cooney, were engaged to do the job and arrived the morning of Tuesday, the 11th of October, 1892. With picks and shovels, they began trenching a narrow channel along the back fence. Macdonaldtown soil was heavy with clay. Each strike gave a dull thud. They worked through the morning until James hit something soft. Cloth, perhaps. Then a smell that turned his stomach. He told Frank he must have struck a buried cat. They lifted the bundle. It was small, wrapped in rags, and far too heavy for an animal. Through the rot, they saw the shape of a child. They immediately stopped digging and sent word for the police. The body was taken that afternoon to the South Sydney morgue. A police surgeon noted that it was very much decomposed and appeared to have been buried for several months. Initially, though the finding was sad, it was not considered suspicious. Infant deaths and quiet backyard burials were a grim but familiar part of life in Sydney's poorer suburbs. The next morning, the workmen returned to finish the trench, and sure enough, not long into their digging, they uncovered another parcel of cloth. Inside lay a second infant. What had seemed a private misfortune began to look deliberate. The police and coroner immediately sealed off the yard, recognizing that two separate burials in the same small space could not be accidental. Newspapers reported the discovery with growing unease, describing it as a most mysterious affair. Public curiosity grew. Neighbors gathered outside the cottage fence, and detectives began treating the scene as a potential crime site rather than a sanitation find. The case turned from sad inevitability to shocking suspicion. Inside the Newtown police station, Senior Constable James Joyce began the painstaking task of tracing the occupants. The landlord, Patrick Mulvey, handed over rent receipts showing that the house had been last leased to John and Sarah Macon. They had moved in on the 29th of June 1892 and left abruptly on the 16th of August, taking their furniture by dray before a bailiff arrived to serve a distress warrant for unpaid rent. Joyce was an experienced officer and a cautious one. He started by verifying the Maykins' previous addresses through rate books and landlord records. Within days, he had charted a web of short-term tenancies radiating from Redfern to Chippendale, each occupied by the same couple and their children, each abandoned suddenly. The pattern alone suggested something beyond coincidence. Neighbors told police of strange sights, the Maykins keeping 2 or 3 babies at once, sometimes more. A pram wheeled in and out at night, bundles carried discreetly through the yard. One woman recalled that the smell of decay hung in the air for days after they left, but no one had thought to speak up. Infant death was common, and grief was often private. Once detectives realized the Burren Street burials might be connected to baby farming, they searched Sydney newspaper archives for adoption advertisements. They reached out to the mothers and reviewed the letters from the people who offered to look after their babies. Despite being signed with various names such as E. Hill, Ray, S. J. McLachlan, and J. Leslie, they noticed several patterns in the letters. They were short, polite replies, offering a good home or a kind motherly lady willing to adopt. These replies all used similar handwriting and language, promises like, "The child will be treated as my own," and requests for payments of £2 to £3. Joyce compared the handwriting to the rental ledgers. They matched. The Maykins were using aliases to adopt the various babies. The obvious question weighed heavy on the police. How many babies had they adopted? By late October, the case had shifted from a coroner's mystery to a criminal pursuit. Joyce and Brown worked through the nights, matching pawnshop records to the baby garments found on the remains in the Burren Street yard. The pawnbrokers described a teenage girl, Blanche Macon, who had pawned bundles of infants' clothing in Redfern and Chippendale over the preceding months. Tickets in her handwriting gave the investigators new addresses to check, and each one brought them closer. On the 2nd of November, Joyce returned to Burren Street to supervise a further excavation. 5 more tiny bodies were uncovered. The total now stood at 7. That evening, Joyce wrote in his report that he believed the deaths to be the work of a systematic baby farming operation run by the Maykins. The urgency of the search intensified. Detectives warned that if the couple were still at large, more children might already be in their hands. Circulars were distributed across the city's police districts describing the pair. John Makin, about 50, dark hair and beard, and of labouring appearance. Sarah Makin, stout, middle-aged, plain in dress, known to use the names Hill, Ray, and McLaughlin. Patrols were told to check recent tenancy changes, lodging houses, and adoption notices in the local press. The city waited. Behind the closed doors of police headquarters, maps were marked and crossed out as officers followed each lead through Sydney's tight backstreets. Somewhere among those lanes, the Maykins were still moving from house to house, still answering advertisements from desperate mothers. John Makin had been born in Dapto in 1845 and was one of 11 children to a farming family. As a young man, he worked hard, a drayman, a labourer, someone who could turn his hand to anything that paid. Sarah was also born in 1845 in Sydney, a city child to an ex-convict father and an Irish mother. She had married young, lost her first husband, Charles, a seaman, and remarried John Makin in 1871. Together, they had 10 children in total, but only 4 of the children were living with them during the 1890s. Blanche, 17, Florence, 11, Clarice, 10, and Tommy, 2. The family seemed ordinary and was described by those who knew them as respectable but very poor. Paul suffered a fall from a wagon in his 40s, which left him with lasting pain and long spells without steady work. His wages shrank, and with them, the family's security. Their rent often in arrears. It was in this economic strain that the Maykins began their grim trade in infant adoptions. Sarah started by presenting herself as a wet nurse, a kind woman willing to help desperate mothers. She had her own children, a steady manner, and an appearance of domestic order. John handled the business side, answering classified advertisements, writing polite letters, and collecting the small fees mothers could manage. By 1891, John and Sarah had refined their trade into a pattern, shifting houses every few months. Each move followed a similar rhythm: new house, new advertisements, new infants. Neighbours noticed bundles arriving and sometimes heard faint cries, but the children soon disappeared. Sarah explained that the babies had been sent to better homes or had died naturally. To the mothers who handed over their infants, Sarah appeared trustworthy, clean, composed, and softly spoken. Amber Murray was 18 when she gave birth to a son named Horace. She lived alone with neither husband nor income, steady enough to raise him. After a few weeks, she placed an advertisement seeking adoption, offering a small payment to anyone kind and motherly. A reply arrived on the 24th of June from 109 George Street, Redfern, signed E. Hill. The letter offered to adopt Horace for about £2 or £3 and promised he would receive a mother's love and attention. Amber travelled to the address, a narrow brick cottage rented by John and Sarah Makin. She handed over her baby and the payment, believing she could visit later. When she returned, the family had already moved. A few weeks earlier, Mary Alice Stacey, a domestic servant living at Petersham, had faced the same predicament. Her daughter was born on the 17th of April, 1892. She could not keep the child and continue her employment, nor could she rely on family support. On the 17th of June, she advertised for adoption. A letter soon came, signed Ray, again from 109 George Street, Redfern, offering to take the baby for £3. The writer explained that the family would soon move to a poultry farm in a healthy suburb. On the 23rd of June, 2 of the Maykins' daughters, Blanche and Clarice, arrived at Mary's house carrying a letter from Mrs. Ray. The note said, "We will be so busy packing and cleaning that I have sent my girls over for the child." It included a pre-written receipt. Mary handed over her baby and the payment. When she tried to visit days later, the house was empty. During the investigation, she identified clothing from pawn tickets in the Maykins' possession, items that matched those she had sent with her child. The same pattern began even earlier that year. Clara Florence Risby, a maid from Woolloomooloo, gave birth to a daughter on the 15th of April, 1892. On the 4th of May, she placed an advertisement offering £5 to anyone who would adopt her baby for life. She received a reply signed S.J. McLaughlin from 16 East Street, Redfern. On the 16th of May, she and her sister visited that address to hand over the baby. They met Sarah Macon, then using the McLaughlin name, who told them she would bring the child up as one of her own. John Macon claimed he had money left to him and was soon taking a poultry farm at Rockdale. Clara returned 2 days later and saw her baby alive and well. On her next visit, however, she was told Mrs. McLaughlin was out with the child. By the week's end, the house stood empty. Another woman, Agnes Todd, handed over her daughter, Elsie, on the 18th of June, the day before the Maykins moved to the Burren Street property. When Agnes read weeks later about bodies found in a backyard, she travelled there herself searching for her daughter, then went straight to the police. Her description of the child's clothes matched items later identified at Burren Street. These women had little in common except poverty, isolation, and the crushing weight of respectability. Each believed she was saving her child from hunger or shame. After the discovery of 5 more bodies at the Burren property, the search for the Maykins had become urgent. The next morning of Thursday, 3rd of November, James Joyce and Alexander Brown set out to find them. They had received information that Sarah would be visiting one of her married daughters near Parramatta Road. The officers found her there around midday and began questioning. When questioned about the Burren Street house and the bodies found there, Sarah quietly admitted she had lived there but denied knowing anything about any bodies. She told police she had only cared for a few infants and that they had since been placed elsewhere. Her answers were calm, brief, but notably, deliberately vague. The officers took her into custody, and she was conveyed to the Newtown lockup, where she was formally detained on suspicion of involvement in the Macdonaldtown deaths. That same afternoon, Joyce proceeded to the Chippendale house, a property they had tracked through rental lodges. It was a cramped dwelling that bore the signs of a hurried occupation, boxes stacked by the wall, little furniture, and laundry half-packed. Inside, he found John Macon, along with his daughters Blanche and Florence. Joyce informed John that he was being arrested on suspicion of the willful murder of an infant child. The girls, both pale and frightened, were also taken into custody for questioning. At Newtown Police Station, Sarah was already waiting. When reunited, she and John offered little explanation beyond claims of having cared for children. However, during questioning, the daughters faltered. They told police their mother often had 2 or 3 babies in her care at once, and that the family moved frequently, sometimes at night, taking the babies with them in a pram or cradle. After each move, the infants were gone. The girls said they were told the children had been placed in good homes, but they never saw them again. Blanche also admitted pawning bundles of baby clothes for her mother, and that she would use aliases like Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Ray. That evening, the daughters were released, while their parents were formally charged on suspicion of the murder of an illegitimate female child, a cautious legal phrasing that allowed police to hold them while further evidence was gathered. They were transferred under guard to the Central Police Station, where news of the arrests was telegraphed across the city. The following morning's papers carried the headline, "The Macdonaldtown Mystery, Arrests Made." Reporters noted that the accused appeared outwardly calm. John was described as respectable in manner, the image of an ordinary labouring man, and Sarah as quiet, self-contained, and with a matronly air. On the 8th of November, the formal inquest opened in the small mortuary at the foot of the domain. The air was heavy with disinfectant and damp linen. Boxes containing the recovered remains were arranged along the wall, each wrapped and numbered. The hearing began there, then moved to the coroner's court in Chancery Square, where the public could crowd the galleries. The city coroner, Henry Shiel, read the list of the 7 bodies recovered from 25 Burren Street. Senior Constable James Joyce gave his evidence in measured tones. He identified John and Sarah Macon as the former tenants and produced the receipts and letters that tied them to various properties and numerous adoptions. On the coroner's direction, detectives were ordered to trace every address previously occupied by the Maykins to determine whether further remains might exist. The next morning, the 9th of November, Joyce and a small team went to 109 George Street, Redfern, one of the houses on their list. Beneath the compacted soil of the yard, they uncovered the body of an infant wrapped in fabric. Examination of the clothing soon matched it to Amber Murray's child, Horace, whose adoption letter signed E. Hill had already been read at the inquest. The discovery confirmed what police had begun to suspect. The burials at Macdonaldtown were not isolated. 2 days later, detectives moved on to another former address, 26 Levy Street, Chippendale. Behind the kitchen wall, the ground gave way to shallow depressions. From them they lifted 2 tiny skeletons, still clothed in the remnants of infants' garments. The press described the scene with a grim restraint, one constable holding a lamp, while another brushed back the earth with his hands. By mid-November, further searches were carried out at Wells Street, East Street, and Zamia Street, Redfern. These yielded no human remains, though the soil showed clear signs of having been recently disturbed. The pattern was now undeniable. Each short tenancy, each sudden move marked another stop in the Makin's circuit of concealment. By the close of the inquest, the coroner had heard from doctors, labourers, landlords, and police. The remains from Burren Street and Levee Street were too far decomposed to reveal how those infants had died. In most, only bones and fabric remained. Only one child, Horace, offered any clue. After examining the small body, Dr. D.S. Knaggs told the court the evidence was consistent with suffocation by external pressure. It was the first clear indication that at least one of the babies had not died from illness or neglect, but by deliberate means. With that finding, the coroner adjourned the inquiry and referred the matter to the Crown. The full weight of the evidence, the graves, the aliases, the letters, and now a medical opinion of suffocation, would move beyond the coroner's bench to a higher court. What began as a mystery of buried infants was now preparing to stand as a charge of murder. The trial of John and Sarah Macon opened before Justice William Charles Windire at the Central Criminal Court, Darlinghurst, in March 1893. The courtroom was packed, the air stifling. Spectators filled the benches and craned for a view of the couple whose crimes had unsettled the city. The Crown prosecutor, Mr. W.C. Cullen, charged that the Makins had taken in infants for payment under false names, then disposed of them in secret. 10 bodies had been found, but the trial centered on one, Horace Murray, whose identity, payment, and manner of death could all be proven. When the defense opened, Sarah McKean insisted she had cared for the babies and placed them out when she could. John Macon claimed ignorance. Their counsel argued that no one had seen a child harmed and that decay made cause of death uncertain. Justice Windire reminded the jury that while the case was circumstantial, circumstances, if all point one way, may be as certain as proof itself. After several hours' deliberation, the jury returned. Both John and Sarah Macon were found guilty of the willful murder of Horace Murray, with a recommendation to mercy for Sarah. On the 30th of March 1893, Justice Windire pronounced sentence: John Macon to be hanged by the neck until dead. Sarah Macon to imprisonment for life with hard labour. John was executed at Darlinghurst Jail on the 15th of August 1893. Sarah died at Parramatta Women's Jail in 1918. When the gruesome discoveries at Burren Street and Redfern were laid bare in late 1892, the city of Sydney found itself confronting a hidden trade that had operated in plain view. The case of John and Sarah Macon became more than a criminal trial. It became a moral shockwave. For working-class suburbs where infant death was tragic but frequent, the idea that the tragedy might be intentional disturbed the faint comfort of routine. The Makins' exposure revealed how the system of baby farming, where infants were handed over for payment under the promise of a good home, had thrived on social shame, poverty, and lax oversight. The discovery of multiple infant remains in the yards of Makins' former homes demolished any illusion of incidental neglect. Public anger forced the New South Wales government to act. The Children's Protection Act, 1892, which was meant to regulate adoptions and childcare, was criticised as a law that had failed to prevent abuse. It made it illegal to accept a lump sum payment for adopting a child under 3 and required registration for nursing homes and carers. But the Makin case showed how easily such rules could be ignored when enforcement was weak and identities were easily hidden. The Makin case reshaped public awareness as much as it did the law. In its aftermath, mothers no longer assumed that an offer of care meant safety. Boarding houses and nurse keepers faced scrutiny, and neighbours began reporting sudden moves or suspicious digging. Coroners and detectives learned to look for patterns, linking repeated tenancies and missing children instead of treating each death in isolation. In the years that followed, adoption and infant care remained legally complex. The Children's Protection Act 1892 was strengthened and later replaced by the 1902 Act, tightening controls and requiring the registration of carers. The word baby farmer became a term of condemnation, and official oversight of adoptions and infant deaths became central to child welfare policy in New South Wales. Yet the tragedy also exposed deeper causes: poverty, social shame, and the desperation of mothers with nowhere to turn. The Makins had not created baby farming, but their case revealed its cruelty, forcing the colony to confront what happened when survival and respectability left no room for compassion. Thanks for listening. Follow on your listening platform to be notified of weekly episodes.